Okay, hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about our causes of market failure in greater depth. In particular, market power, externalities, and asymmetric information. So we'd say market power exists when there's one actor, one entity in the market who's able to influence the price. Typically, we'd assume that this will happen if you have a monopoly, like a single seller. You could also have a single buyer, a monopsony, such as would be the case if you have a single payer plan in healthcare, where you'd have like a single buyer. Well, anyway, if you had an entity that is able to influence the price of the good by virtue of being the only seller or the only buyer, they would have market power. And this would create a distortion relative to the perfectly competitive model, relative to the efficient equilibrium. We would expect, other things equal, firms with market power are going to raise the price and lower the output above what the competitive market would provide. That's true if you have like a seller, like a monopoly. On the other hand, if you have a monopsony buyer, we'd expect they're going to drive the price down. Buyers like lower prices, sellers like high prices. And so if you have a monopoly seller, they're going to raise the price and generate profits. If you have a monopsony buyer, they're going to lower the price to generate savings for them. Anyway, this behavior introduces inefficiency. It also generates profits for the firm. And so there's something difficult here because on the one hand, we think of market power. They're going to raise the price relative to the competitive market would provide. And we think, well, that's not good relative to consumers. On the other hand, those profits are necessary sometimes to provide an incentive for firms to operate in the first place. And such is the argument often given for the relatively high prices in the pharmaceutical market. Externalities is another source of market failure. So here we have a situation where you have some external effect that's being created as a result of some behavior from primary actors. So externality requires some primary activity, an external effect, and bystanders. If there's no bystanders, there's no externality. The basic idea is you have some primary activity. It could be like producing some output that generates pollution. The external effect would be the pollution. If there's bystanders that are affected by the pollution, now you've got the externality, right? So you have the primary activity, which is the generation of whatever is the product. You have the external effect, the pollution, and then you have the bystanders. You could also have a positive externality. It doesn't have to be a negative externality. Maybe you like the smell of popcorn at the movie theater, and so you're walking by the movie theater and you smell popcorn, and there's this positive effect. You get this positive, pleasing odor. Maybe especially if you don't buy popcorn, if you buy popcorn, now you become a member of the primary activity. But suppose other people besides you go and buy popcorn. That behavior generates this popcorn smell that presumably you enjoy. That's the positive externality. You're the bystander, and you're able to benefit from this effect without buying popcorn yourself. The problem then, of course, is that the decision makers themselves are going to pay attention only to their own costs and their own benefits. They're going to neglect the external effect. Whoever's making the popcorn doesn't often think, or whoever's buying the popcorn doesn't often think, oh, this is going to be good for those who are walking by and will smell this. On the other hand, like the sellers of products that are created and involve some type of pollution aren't typically going to quantify or even be aware of the scope or the degree of the pollution that's generated. Why? It's difficult to quantify. Also, it's difficult to determine the effect, even in the aggregate, of the external externality. So what ends up happening is the true social cost, which encompasses the effect on both the decision maker and the bystanders, is going to be higher than the decision makers are aware of. In the case of negative externalities, they're going to overproduce. They're going to generate this larger social cost than what they're responding to. They're only going to respond to their own individual private cost. They continue producing as long as marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost, and since the cost is looking artificially low, they produce far beyond when they should stop. The opposite problem with the social benefit being larger than the private benefit in the case of positive externalities. So in the case of positive externalities, individuals pay attention to their own benefit. They're ignoring the additional benefit that's befalling other people. And therefore, they're stopping too soon. They're not producing enough of the activity relative to society's perspective. So those are the problems associated with externalities. Asymmetric information is going to refer to the imbalance of information between buyers and sellers typically. There's two problems that result: adverse selection and moral hazard. So adverse selection happens when there's more than one type, presumably, and whatever is the less desirable type becomes more prevalent among those likely to be selected. So think about this from the insurance case. Who wants to buy health insurance? Those who think they're going to need it. So you have this problem where a lot of young, healthy people don't want to buy health insurance. And so then among those who are interested in buying health insurance, they tend to disproportionately be older and less healthy. So this is a particular issue. This is precisely the issue that sick people are more interested in paying for insurance than healthy people. This is the adverse selection problem. Adverse selection happens prior to the market activity, prior to the transaction. Moral hazard happens when one party to the transaction acts opportunistically. So this is where, like, after you've got insurance, maybe you take more risks driving. Or after you have insurance, maybe you don't take care of your health as well because you know you can go to the doctor. Those would be examples of moral hazard. The key with moral hazard is that this happens after the fact. Another place where moral hazard would happen with people behaving opportunistically is like in the labor market. If you're paid a fixed wage and you decide not to work as hard as you presumably could, that's called shirking. And there you have a worker who's not adequately incentivized to work hard. They're subject to the problem of moral hazard after they've agreed and been paid whatever is their hourly wage. They decide to set a level of effort lower than what the employer would want them to. That's another example of moral hazard. Adverse selection happens prior to the transaction. Moral hazard happens after the transaction.